Similarly, for the last decade, we thought we were entering to an era of great power competition between China and the US. But the truth is, if you look at this year alone, both the US and China seem to be determined to undermine their influence in the world. And so I'm not sure a G2 world makes sense anymore.
President just rightly said, let's get off this vicious cycle of sanctioning each other. Let's really think about the world. I think U.S. and China have to find a way to work together. And now for the rest of the world, we have to, give more reflection of the G20 in the global system.
Well, thank you everybody for joining this FPCI roundtable on the next world order. This is actually the second roundtable that we've had. The first one we did in New York, and we worked with the Club de Madrid, and we gathered participants from the north and the south, and to discuss the issue of the next world order. And we're using the word next, not new, because the new means you throw away the old. Next means there has to be a combination of the old and the new, and that creates the next world order. Right? And we are fully aware that the next world order is something that we don't know the contours of. We're only just feeling different places, trying to get a picture of it. So this is why nobody's right, nobody's wrong, right? I look forward to your comments. I will not be introducing you because your names will be, what do you call it? Printed at the bottom of the screen when you speak. But I want to begin with the first question, and it is that it seems there's general consensus that the world order, as we know, is crumbling or in duress, and confidence in the rules-based world order has been shaken. There's also a perception held by some that the world is moving in the wrong direction. Right? So I'm just wondering if any of you would like to comment on this. Do you agree that confidence in a rules-based world order has been shaken recently, and why is that? Yeah, and is the world moving in the wrong direction? Maybe I'll start with Dr. Henry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dino, for really chairing this, timely and excellent panel we have here. I agree with you. I think that the rule of the order, particularly the rule of UN, has been under tremendous stress and even threats, probably. As we can see, the world has been really, undergoing enormous challenges, changes, and even war going on right now. And so, we've been living 80 years after the UN and after Second World War, and then now we're at the crossroads. If we're going to maintain and sustain and enhance and improve this global order and global system, then probably we can, as you said, we could get into the next phase. But if we do nothing, we just sit there and then we're having a rivalry position among each other, then we're probably going to see the world really in a big chaotic situation. I just got back from G20 in Johannesburg. I had the Munich Security Conference and Rockefeller Foundation, and also the presidency of G20 in South Africa organized a meeting, and we talked about 10 Sherpas of the G20 countries. And then we had a 2-day brainstorming there. And then the same thing, we were talking about how to maintain this, sustain this multilateral system. And you remember, Dino, we had this Paris Peace Forum 10 of 10 dinner that we talked about the same thing. So I would think, I was quite surprised when in February this year, I was at the Berlin, we kicked off the Munich Security Conference report. I was one of the panelists there. For the first time across Atlantic, they recognize there's a multipolarity and that there's a multipolar world probably is emerging. And also, furthermore, I think the world does, 80 years ago, the system design was not really fit for outgrowing of the world economy, global south, and the BRICS countries. So So in that sense, I think that if you look at the developed countries, used to account 70, 80% of the global GDP. US alone counts 50%. But now, BRICS countries' GDP is larger than G7 now, if you check on the PPP values. So what I think is, the political system, the global governance system, and economic system, we probably have to do some reform to really reflect these enormous changes. I mean, that's why we're seeing some new global institutions like AIIB. We see new development banks. Now Shanghai Cooperation Organization is also designing a new bank. But also the same thing, we need to reform World Bank, IMF, and even could reform UN and even Security Council. So I will not go that far, but I'm saying the world is already outgrowing of the feet. We were tailored to 80 years ago, and now we have to make some new tailors, new improvement to fit the reality of the global situation now.
Thanks. Gordon, your turn.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be back here in Jakarta, and very timely. Over the last several months, I've been in Seoul, Tokyo, Bangkok, Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and then just in the last several weeks in London, Belgrade, Bucharest, Berlin, and Hobart in Tasmania before coming here. And I can tell you that every single place I went to, these questions that you're asking are on everybody's mind. And part of that is because we may not know what the next rules-based order looks like or the next order looks like, but we know that the old one is changing. So I've taken to telling people I feel like I'm in 1989 again. In 1989, I'm a child of the Cold War. I couldn't imagine an end to the Cold War. And all of a sudden, I'd seen Glasnost and Perestroika and the Reykjavik summit. And yet, even with the fall of the Berlin Wall, this month, November of 1989, I still couldn't conceptualize what we now call the post-Cold War era. But one thing is pretty clear. The post-Cold War era, I don't know if you'd call it an order, but the post-Cold War era is over. And I don't know exactly when it ended. Historians will debate this. Was it Xi Jinping's first term? Probably not. His unprecedented third term? Probably. Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014? Probably not. Certainly by the full-scale invasion in 2022, when we can no longer talk about post-war Europe and there's war raging in the middle of Europe, things are fundamentally different. Was it Donald Trump's first term in 2016? Probably not. But certainly by his reelection, everybody recognizes that the system that we thought we had is over. So what does the next system look like? Again, I think like most of the panelists, I'm not entirely sure. I will tell you that I don't have great confidence in the tools that we're using thus far. Multipolarity is a really cool thing to say, but it doesn't mean anything to me. All it means is there's no order, right? Because there's lots of different poles, and it depends on the issue. It depends on what, if you're talking about economic issues or trade issues or security issues or environment, where the poles are. It just means there's no overall structure, right? Similarly, for the last decade, we thought we were entering to an era of great power competition between China and the US. And recently at the APEC summit, President Trump even used the preferred Chinese framing of G2. But the truth is, if you look at this year alone, both the US and China seem to be determined to undermine their influence in the world. And so I'm not sure a G2 world makes sense anymore. And then on top of that, one of the things I do know is that Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump are all old, all of questionable health, and they will not be there forever. So I can't tell you what the new order is going to look like, but I can tell you is that everyone I've talked to in the last few months is interested in what we call like-minded partners, to deal with anxiety about China, to deal with growing anxiety about the United States, and to hold together whatever vestiges of the rules-based order that we can. And that may seem like naive, but it's actually already happening. So after the US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, Australia and Japan together heroically, resurrected it in the form of the progressive agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, right? And the UK joining made a really big difference. But now they're looking at Korea, and obviously Indonesia's expressed some interest. So we're trying to rebuild something. So that's how I would frame this conversation. What vestiges of the old system do we want to hold on to collectively in this era of uncertainty? And then what new things do we want to build? And I can't think of a better organization to think about that than FPCI.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up today. Do you think, no matter what happens, the American unipolar moment is done and over with? We can never go back to that era.
Now, look, I've been taken to saying I don't know what the next order will look like, but there are several things that I know for sure. Number one, I know that globally defense spending is going to increase. Every single country in the world is increasing its defense spending. I don't like it. Like probably most of the panels, I'd rather be using that money for education or infrastructure or healthcare or climate change response. You know, that's what we'd like to do. But the reality is the first responsibility of the nation state is to defend the nation state. And even though I'm not yet willing to give up on the U.S. as an essential power globally, right? It's my homeland, but there's no question that the U.S. provided security foundation upon which the rules-based order was built is shaken. So in that environment, you have to talk about what's different. And the difference is that foundational element is, it's not gone, not 100% gone, but it's shaken enough that we have to collectively start thinking about alternatives, right? So that's one of the things I know for sure.
Okay. Far, same question. Confidence shaken, why?
Well, it's very ironic because if we were to go back to, say, 1993, everyone back then was talking about Clash of Civilization by Samuel Huntington. But then if you were to delve deeper into the works of Samuel Huntington then, he also wrote another article referring to the international system as uni-multipolar. And what he actually meant by uni-multipolar was that you have the United States astride on the international system. Meanwhile, you have other major powers in the UN Security Council, such as Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. And what Samuel Huntington had in mind was that the power dynamics would work in such a way where United States would call the shots and the rest of the permanent members of the UN Security Council would follow. What is surprising is the fact that the academic and the epistemic community, those who agree on the universal causes of what triggers A to lead to B in international relations, didn't pick up on that. Everyone was so much engrossed and consumed by collapse of civilization, and even the US State Department had to issue a statement that the US State Department does not endorse or subscribe to clash of civilization just to appease the audience in Malaysia back then. But then it carried on, it developed a momentum. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a significant chunk of the debate on unipolarity, which was emphasized by Charles Krauthammer in the Time magazine. Then there were other people echoing the views of the unipolar moment, tracing either to Charles Krauthammer or Samuel Huntington. But then there were other people, even John Mearsheimer, if you go through his works carefully, he referred to that unipolar moment as very unique and something that is no longer tenable. But then the issue is when we look at the current state of affairs, say Gaza, it's quite bizarre to see a war continuing for 2 long years, even when the global public opinion is changing. So in other words, you have a United States that is captive to some kind of special interest in its own country. So within that context, is United States able to exercise its role in a very responsible and even fiscally prudent manner? Because as and when you have any financial crisis, one of the ways in which the United States redeemed itself, unlike United Kingdom, during the global financial crisis, Prime Minister Gordon Brown resorted to using the G20 mechanism in a very aggressive manner, enlisting G20 and eventually President Obama to restore the whole international financial system. But in the case of current administration, I just do not see that kind of faith and trust in even G7, let alone G20. But then, referring to your issue earlier, what is the exact interpretation? I don't think anyone can put his or her thumb on the issue and say this is the right moment to understand international relations. It's very privy to the kind of information, privileged information, highly privileged information that you are actually allowed to listen in on. So for instance, if I may, if we were to have this roundtable, say 1 month ago, prior to the ASEAN East Asian Summit, I would agree the rules-based order is completely broken. But then the chatter that I get from my capital in Kuala Lumpur is that Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim got on very well with President Trump. And he was the first Asian leader to actually get into the beast and have a 40-minute conversation, a four-eye conversation. And again, based on what I could gather from people close to the Prime Minister himself, is that this relationship can be exponentially expanded to help the likes of major powers. So one example, ironically, happens to be China. So when Prime Minister Anwar got on very well with President Donald Trump, the first beneficiary was the aversion to the trade war in China. Because there was the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, having negotiation, the 5th round negotiation, subsequent to London, Geneva, in Kuala Lumpur. Scott Bessent was having a negotiation with Li Changgang, but Scott Bessent didn't like the Chinese negotiator. And Scott Bessent said, he is completely unhinged. We don't want to deal with him. Kuala Lumpur, for reasons unknown to me on this particular occasion, was able to convince China to immediately enlist He Lifeng, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of China, if I'm not mistaken, to come in as the immediate negotiator to Scott Bessent. And they concluded something that resembled a deal which they can paddle and work on in Busan, South Korea. So when you have this kind of minimalist agreement from an unpredictable administration such as Trump, does that constitute progress? So that is the questions that I myself is struggling with.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question that we discussed earlier, that the next world order does not mean a new one. And a major part of the present and old world order would need to be preserved. The institutions, the norms, and so on. But Professor Catherine Turner, what do you think is essential to be preserved?
Okay, well, I echo the thanks, Dino, for the invitation to be part of this really important conversation and to be physically here in Jakarta with you as well. It's been very fascinating to learn a bit more about the perspectives from this side of the globe. So as you mentioned there, my background is international law rather than international relations. And I think the observation that I keep coming back to when I think about these changes and this critical juncture that we're in relation to change is that over the past couple of decades, perhaps, we've had a very strong focus on the rules element and much less on the order element of rules-based order. And so it's become almost, I think we reached a high point a few years ago where the order had become so normative and so thickened in its normative stance that perhaps it was starting to look then alien and opening up cracks that were there to be exploited. And so I suppose what I mean by that is that we've really, since the end of the Cold War order, we've had this proliferation of specialist regimes in international law proliferation of supranational regimes, supranational adjudication bodies, and my field of interest is peace and peacemaking. And what we can see is over the past 20 years the progressive institutionalization of very specific understandings and bodies of rules around what is peace, what is required from states, and not only what is required, but who interprets and who implements that. So the institutionalization of these rules in relation to how the international space is governed, and also then the professionalization of the field of practice, which has the effect then of sort of consolidating a very particular way of looking at the world, and in a way that doesn't necessarily translate across cultures. And we had a period of normative development, and we reached a high point probably 5 to 6 years ago with this. But from the perspective even of the United Kingdom, we've been recognising the signs coming of increasing political discontent with this focus on rules at the expense of order. And so I think it's quite useful to distinguish then sort of this thick substantive understanding of what the international rules-based order is, in that there's a particular way that we need to do things, compared to the vision of the Charter, which is much more procedural, and the original sort of frameworks for the peaceful settlement of disputes between nations, for example, the emphasis on diplomacy, the emphasis on the responsibility to act within a multilateral framework and to avoid the use of force and territorial acquisition by force, for example, and the respecting of sovereignty on an equal basis. So I think, when we look at that question of what's changing, I would say the willingness to be rule takers on the part of kind of other regions in the world beyond the European and the Atlantic space, coupled with then sort of increasing and realigning orders and alliances within that, is something that allows us to really think about, well, if we look at it from an order perspective rather than a rules perspective, are there difficulties with that particular framework if we stripped it back to procedural norms in relation to how we interact with each other? And really what would be the risks of saying that, well, it's the United Nations itself that's the problem rather than the ways in which it's developed. And so I think that's something really to think about in that balance and how we proceed with it. Yeah.
John? And also I'd like you to address the question of, is the UN Charter now, is it adequate still? Or is there a need to revise it? Because it's not the Bible or Quran, right?
Right.
It's man-made. And yeah.
Well, first of all, great conversation already. Many things I'd like to comment upon. Mentioning the Charter, of course, it is formally just a treaty. It is one of many treaties. So there is no particular hierarchy internationally. Of course, we know it has, some people say, a quasi-constitutional character and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, it's just a treaty. And there are other treaties that one might argue are even more important. For example, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Or, for example, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which codified thousands of years of order. So law of diplomacy, for example, has a pedigree of literally thousands of years. So, your basic earlier question about a kind of disruption and the idea of a next a world order is correct in its presumption. There has never been a real total rupture. There's not been a tabula rasa. All order ends, all beginnings start afresh. When the League of Nations ended and the United Nations began, just to mention the Charter, a number of elements were directly retained from the previous order. For example, the International Court of Justice, which was one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, the highest judicial body, explicitly retains and takes over the predecessor of the Permanent Court of International Justice. There was also a whole lot of agreements concluded during the League of Nations. In 1951, the Secretary General of the United Nations, in response to states being worried about the continuity of these, actually issued a report that was adopted confirming, no, all those agreements, which include things like territorial arrangements, the attachment of the Mosul Vilayet to Iraq, for example, the end of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and so forth, all of those are retained. So I think it's good to get out of our mind the idea of tabula rasa. We're not starting from scratch. Second of all, I think what's important is to say that the charter nonetheless codified critical elements. And if we go back to, I like to talk about this era right now where, and I've been feeling this for 20 years, what I characterize as a post-Westphalian flux. There's this flux, this uncertainty, absence of predictability, enormous instability. But I say post-Westphalian because Westphalia was this predecessor of the nation state, by the way, the invocation of the nation state. The nation state is a blip in historical terms. The state is ancient. The nation is a European invention of a few hundred years ago. And the nation state was even really only the last hundred years. But in Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, there were 3 treaties, and there were really only 2 or 3 fundamental things decided. And they're very interesting, and interesting to retain a little bit today. The first was the principle of sovereign equality, that states as such, in recognition of each other, reciprocally are sovereign, have exclusive jurisdiction within their territory and population. The second is that sovereignty is actually already conditioned on one thing, which was respect for religious minorities in particular, which is otherwise, we would say today, a kind of interference in domestic affairs of sorts. Now, the UN, 300 years later, basically drew a couple other lines. They said the use of force as an instrument of settlement of disputes, that has to be set in the dustbin of history. And the second was not only this idea of protection of minorities, but something more than that, the basic idea that the state must use its responsibility, its sovereignty, to respect the well-being. Article 55 of the UN Charter says the well-being of the people. Now, a lot of that's articulated in human rights, but not exclusively human rights, humanitarian issues and so forth, and then good, friendly relations between states. I think that's a critical marker in historical progress, and it would strike me as shocking if states today are ready to sacrifice those 2 basic principles. I don't think they're ready to say we return to the use of force as an instrument of dispute resolution, or that we're happy to say, yeah, what goes on within states doesn't matter. And I'll tell you, last thing, I'll tell you why. Because we now live in such a complex interdependent world that issues, I mean, if we talk about now issues that are really challenging the world, climate change, pandemics, global economic integration around things like currencies. There's a process of de-dollarization, but there's cryptocurrency. What is a cryptocurrency? It doesn't even fit a state, never mind a nation-state paradigm. So I think in these things, there are so many challenges. We need the cooperation. We need to retain some of these elements. But the Charter itself has demonstrated insufficiencies. So to answer your question, my last point, there are well-known insufficiencies. The Security Council does not reflect the political reality of the day, nor is it functional. And it reminds me a little bit about how GATT became the WTO and became kind of dysfunctional. We have a dysfunctional Security Council. That does not serve the real interests of states, however you want to characterize them. We need the norm, some basic norms, but we're going to have to adapt them. And then I think hopefully there will be some reform. There has to be some reform.
Henry, you want Security Council. You brought it nicely to him because he's been talking about it. Share with us your thoughts on how to reform the Security Council.
Yes. Just before that, I think what I think actually, the global system, UN system, is under a lot of challenge. But the regional, there's a lot of going on. Like RCEP is one of the biggest successful, most successful free trade agreement in the world now for this region of the world, and ASEAN become China's largest trading partner after that as well. And of course, also you have CPTPP also. UK just joined, and China also applied to join. We actually, CCG was promoting China to join that, so that we have a lot of more integrated, system that to really to make up the shortage of the UN system, like Belt and Road Initiative as well. China has launched this, which has already spent 300 billion US dollars for, $1 trillion US dollar for 3,000 projects worldwide. I mean, we had a very successful project here for the speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung. I mean, cut the distance from 4 hours to 40 minutes. So that's a good example. And there's many more. There's more regional, China, Africa, China, ASEAN, China, Latin American, China, Central Asia, Arab work. So there's a lot of economic incentive to really sustain this globalization. But coming back to the UN, absolutely I agree. That the UN needs a lot of improvement, enhancement. So, and also we had an early comment about Gaza and of course UN and Ukraine issues like that. There's a lot of, unilateral veto, basically single veto. For example, Gaza. I don't know how many times U.S. vetoed that, and also Ukraine and Russia has been vetoed that. So that's paralyzed the UN system. So I have a suggestion made is that I published that on the Foreign Policy a magazine just about during the summit of UN this year, that I suggest probably G20 can really be active members of the UN Security Council. For example, you have now currently have a system in UN Security Council about 5 permanent members, 10 countries rotating, 15 countries. So I would suggest that we still keep the P5, but let's get the other 16 of the G21 into the Security Council, including European Union and the African Union, which that's great representation. G20 represents 85% of global GDP. And then how to solve this issue of the abuse of the veto by those big countries, particularly U.S. and Russia. For example, since last 80 years, Russia has vetoed 130 times, something like that. U.S. has been vetoed 100 times. And UK is about 30 times, China is about 20 times, and France is about 18 times. So you can see, those most countries, particularly US and Russia, been vetoing this. That's really stopped the war implementing. So what my suggestion is that let's add the other 16, G20 countries into the Security Council as associate permanent members. They do not. We still keep the P5 have a veto power, but then only when the single veto, we need to subject to a two-thirds approval of this G21 Council. But then what about the other 10 countries that used to be rotating? No, we give them a chance again. Let's do another two-thirds override of veto of the single veto at the General Assembly. So you have a two guarantee, have a two representation of this great representation, so we can get rid of this unilateral abuse of the veto by those big countries, particularly the U.S. and Russia, probably. And then that would be really good to keep the world in the right direction. And also, that also reflects the global south. More say into this global system, because that's the calling from the, right now at the UN General Assembly, you see the meeting there, global south is underrepresented. So let's get African Union and all those countries into the Security Council. I would think this is a great way to reform that, and so that we can probably to reflect this multipolar world. I mean, multipolar world is not the problem. It's that we need a system to govern that. We need a system to really glue everybody together. We have to face the reality. It is a multipolar world, whether you like it or not, but it is. It's just how we can really make a system, make it work. And then we need to really redesign a little bit, improve that UN and security. But also in addition to, we have climate change, we have AI, we have pandemic. All those needs to be strengthened, maybe some new institutions. Like US has created out of the WHO. China just announced they're donating $500 million to the WHO to really provide those public goods that is still needed by the world. We cannot just wash hands and stand by. We have to do something. So I think the approach by China and a lot of the global south countries are really India, South Africa, Brazil, and all those countries. And also green globalization. European Union is doing that too. We have to, climate change is not a fake news, it's real, right? We have to, Australia, New Zealand, everybody. So I would think, this is a comprehensive design, a comprehensive review, and then we need to build up that narrative and momentum to do that.
Let me ask this question, so that's a very interesting formula, and in New York at the UNGA, I heard a lot of similar things, different ideas on how to reform the UN Security Council. my question is this fantasy? I mean, would the P5 say, yeah, no, you know, we have these special seats, now we're just gonna give it away and go into a different arrangement, right? So is there a pathway by which this would become a reality? Yeah.
So I've been reacting to the two previous comments on this, in that obviously I would like to see these types of reforms. I have a hard time imagining any of the current P5 abandoning their unique positions in that front. And more importantly, in the conversations I've had in the last several years, to be honest, the UN does not factor. Right? Because in the end, if we're focusing on the Security Council of the UN itself, that's a very top-down approach to the rules-based order. And what I'm seeing instead is a very grassroots, bottom-up approach, which again, these words don't mean a lot, but basically like-minded countries. And so I said there are certain things I know for sure that are going to take place in this new era, and that is relationships between like-minded countries are going to continue to accelerate. And part of that has been 20 years of growing anxiety, not about the rise of China, which everybody aided and abetted and benefited from, but also the way China has used its power, particularly in the region recently. And then real anxiety about the trustworthiness of the United States, the guarantor of the system before. So in that environment, I'm taking it from a perspective of a country like Australia. Australia's relations with Canada, with the UK, with Germany, with France, with Mexico, with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with India, they're all the best ever in history. Why? Because everybody's looking for like-minded partners to deal with this uncertain environment. That's very grassroots, and that, to be honest, transcends the whole idea of the global South or not. Again, having just come from Eastern Europe, right, where the Romanians are keenly interested in this, the Serbians, who are not part of NATO, not part of the EU, but they're keenly interested in that. The core thing here is, well, I understand the legal infrastructure, but you have to go back to base principles, and the base principles is countries like most of those around this table here do not want to live in a world where might makes right. We don't want to live in a world, to quote Thucydides, where the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And that just means that when I'm talking about holding together vestiges of the rules-based order, it is a bottom-up collective action approach that won't be solved by tinkering, with a top-down approach like the thing. So I don't want to dismiss it altogether, but I find myself finding that's a little bit fanciful, in this current age.
But I want to follow up on this question. I agree with you. We don't want a world where might makes right, yeah. But I'm just noticing great powers. They say that when it's convenient, when they can afford to do so, it doesn't cost them strategically. But when their national strategic interests are at stake, they don't do that. Yeah. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment, and I know you want to comment more.
Yeah, I would like to, but on that too. So two things that have changed, I think, and the first is about technology. So historically, geography largely dictated. And geography does not dictate anymore. It's significant, but it does not dictate. And so you mentioned like-minded, but I would use a kind of orthodox international relations idea of common interest or shared interest. And there have been now increasing multilateral arrangements. I mean, there was even a group at the UN for some time, I don't know if it's still called this, called the Mountain Group. It was 10 states. They had nothing in common except they happened to have mountains. It was like Kyrgyzstan and New Zealand and, I think Canada and Australia were in it too, and so forth. But they would meet occasionally and try and compare. I think Chile was in it and so forth. And then they were from different parts of the world, but they had shared interests, and they were trying to understand how can we, through minilateralism, not this multilateral, but kind of bespoke, tailored arrangements, cooperate to deal with the things that we are facing, real interests. I think that's a very powerful thing. We now know that the way in which these will manifest are not the result of historical legacy of colonialism, or they're going to transcend these things. Those elements matter a bit. Affinities, the Commonwealth, La Francophonie. Yeah, but they're not really that important. Romania is now a member of La Francophonie, for example. It's not because of historical, it's because they find some interest in it. Now, what I think we need to think about is how will these be able to be operationalized that deal with the kind of challenges that Henry was talking about, which are really real challenges. I was mentioning them too, pandemics and so forth. And power now comes into this, because politics is, we know about power. In the previous manifestations, key states, even the idea of polarity, imagines on our head, there's a pole with power associated with the pole, emanating or controlling. I think that's a little misleading. I would even prefer to talk about kind of zero polarity, but where there are significant actors. But then the question is, vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis whom? In what kind of reach? And I think there's a lot of flux in this. And what we know, and I think you were mentioning it, Henry, at the end of the Second World War, we had a single country. The US had something like 55% of global GDP. It was crazy high. Nobody's near that anymore. I mean, the Americans are 20-something%. It depends how they inflate their GDP with stocks and whatever. But if you really look at it, they're coming down. China's come up. In 1945, China was like microscopic. I mean, well, of course, it's post-49. But I mean, in terms of GDP, if you look at, you just said, the G20 now, 85%, and so forth. So I think we have to reimagine. And I would even suggest, the last thing, we need to find new words, new terms for this. And I'm not sure what they are. That's part of the challenge. How do we articulate it? How do we understand it? But I would say diminish some elements like geographic assumptions. Where is real power now? I'm not sure where that is. There are certain technological innovations that are going to transcend what we have imagined to be. They used to be resource-based. They're not necessarily going to be resource-based.
Yeah, I completely agree with John. I was thinking that before we start to think about who should be on the Security Council, we need to step back and think about what it is that that body needs to achieve. And so if, and that also takes us to the question then of what is the threat that we think that we're responding to, that we need a collective security order to secure us against. And so the Charter and the P5 derive very clearly from a land-based war and the need to, and we see this in the sort of the history of the Security Council in the way it determines its threats to international peace and security, in the way it then evokes and allows action on foot of that. But if we were to then imagine what that looks like with the threats that we have now, the alignments are really very significantly different in terms of who is facing the biggest threat from climate change, for example, and to what extent should that dictate the level of power or the level of influence that they have within the Security Council. The private actors and the technology companies, for example, like the global problem of technology-facilitated violence against women. How do we capture that? Can we even capture that in a state-based system? But that's just one example of the disproportionate and unchecked power of private economic interests and actors. And so I think it really is, we go back to that question of what is the threat that we now think that we are facing as a global society? Who is going to be most impacted by this threat? And probably alongside that, who has the resources to do the most good? So if you've got the island nation states, for example, who are facing the complete loss of their territory because of climate change, alongside the states that have the deepest pockets or the greatest interest in the technologies in being able to alleviate that problem, for example. And that would be a very interesting, I think, mapping exercise. First of all, in terms of like to what extent is there consensus globally across orders and across regions on what the threat is and how we would sort of rank or afford priority to those threats? And then who's willing to step up to address them? You know, who is willing to acknowledge in the face of this massive remilitarization and securitization that we're facing, in this like retreat back into state threats and warfare and in Europe, the risk of land warfare in Europe. But the frustrating thing is that actually, you know, the idea of sort of tanks rolling in, it's only a small percentage of the threat that we currently face from any hostile actors that we currently have, as the UK, for example. You know, a lot of this discourse of security and around Security Council and military intervention and remilitarization it assumes kinetic threat and just simply doesn't get to many of the other different types of information warfare and grey zone tactics that countries all across the world are both employing employing and being subject to at the same time. So it would be very interesting to map that out.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned the term intervention or interference. Now I want to go there because I think in the UN Charter, there's it addressed that issue of non-interference. Yeah. Yes, and then in ASEAN, there is also a sacred thing. This non-interference thing. It's actually in the declaration. The reality is that interference is just everywhere. And in fact, you know, the United States has interfered in more places. And yet the United States is the writer of the UN Charter. I mean, do we have just to accept that this is just a natural part of world affairs? I mean, how do we do that? I mean, I think even in Western countries now, you are experiencing interference from other countries. Yeah, yeah. So I would really like to know, in the next world order, do we just accept, hey, this is how things are anyway, so there's not much we can do about it? Anyone want to comment on it?
I wanted to respond kind of to Far's earlier things. I mean, his focus far on Huntington and Mearsheimer stuff was a much more negative view than my focus during those eras. I thought we were moving towards Star Trek, right? I thought this was the ever increasing globalization, ease of travel, cooperation, communication, working together on issues like climate change, and even things like 9/11 were bumps in the road, but we were still heading in a very positive direction globally, and that included this issue you're wrestling with. So I understand individual states have sensitivities to interference in their economy, and not just their economy, but their societies. But the responsibility,
and politics.
But their responsibility to protect human rights, international aid, international conflict. Increasingly, as we live in an interconnected world, and we saw that during the post-Cold War era, we knew more than ever before, and there came a responsibility as global citizens not to allow horrible things to happen. And so today, we're having a war in Sudan that I know nothing about. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I was just shocked at how horrible it is. Yeah. But that's now happening in an environment where nobody is intervening. Is that the kind of rules-based order we want? Where just horrendous things can happen out of the sight of the international community, where the international community does nothing? So there's a tension there, right? So I understand both in the ASEAN Charter and the UN Charter that fundamental notion of sovereignty, but I had thought we were moving in a different direction than that, right? We were much more of a global community, and it now seems like we're moving away from that, and I'm not sure, a la Sudan, that's a good thing.
Are we talking about two different things? One is military intervention, humanitarian intervention, and the other one is the political interference, right? So are these two different animals? Or?
Yeah. So first of all, formally under the UN Charter, intervention, which refers usually to territorial integrity, and usually that means force, is prohibited. So unless there is an authorization of the Security Council, you may not intervene in the affairs and nor the territorial integrity of the state. I would leave aside self-defense because that wouldn't be intervention, and there may be some. I mean, you shouldn't be speeding past the frontier. But you're right that Article 2.4 also talks about not to interfere in the domestic affairs of a state. The question is what constitutes domestic and what's not domestic. And what we were developing after the Second World War, and even before that, was a greater degree of cooperation. And don't forget that the UN Charter explicitly stipulates cooperation between states. There is a duty to cooperate for all sorts of reasons, right? So collective security, we could say, other things. I think what we're concerned about is that this degree of reach now has become so far, and a lot of it through covert means, and a lot of it purposefully trying to undermine the political integrity or change the politics of the state. That's very problematical. And I think we do need to really think or have a good, robust discussion about kind of proper degrees. And I had this experience in the context of, you mentioned Eastern Europe. For example, Hungarian, there was an infamous law called the Hungarian status law. And Hungary and some other states adopted laws saying that they would arrogate to themselves a protection of their not citizens, ethnic confrères, brothers. And this is, by the way, what happened in Russia in 1999, the adoption of the law on the protection of compatriots abroad. They said, well, we have a right to engage in your country with regard to persons in your state who are not our citizens, but share our ethnic. This was the kind of downside of the nation-state paradigm. That caused enormous disruption. It was very much interfering. And at that time, we did work out a kind of way of adjusting it, saying, well, look, states do have interests, and they may even have ethno-cultural interests. I mean, here in Southeast Asia, you can tell me better, but I know there are groups that have trans-frontier ethnic or linguistic communities, Malays in southern Thailand, I mean, to pick one example. It's not illegitimate for a state or other communities to say, well, we want to maintain relations, we maybe even have concerns about it. It's another question if you start to interfere actively politically and especially covertly to undermine the legitimate authority of the actual state and their citizenry. So working those difficult things out, it's kind of like a modus vivendi. How do we live together with this complexity in a rules-based order? I think I would be very interested to know, if I may say, because I had relations years ago with the Chinese government, partly with the State Ethnic Affairs Commission. And you may know, that China is principally, the Han population is the center dominant community. But all of the ethnic nationalities are on the frontiers, and several of them have trans-frontier brethren. Very problematical. So working out the kind of relations is a key element to a new peace.
Carl?
I was wondering if I could revisit the issue of intervention. It's very unique because ASEAN or anyone interested in the study of ASEAN usually refer to the red line about non-intervention in ASEAN. But what many people do not actually know is that the lights of, using the words like-minded or the lights of John Funston at Australian National University has actually written a very prescient article on what non-intervention actually means within the context of ASEAN. And it's based on two principles. This was written as early as 1994 when he was in Singapore. So this is what John said. Non-intervention is in ASEAN is premised on two basic principles. One pillar, no member state of ASEAN shall overtly or covertly support the opposition of another member state. A key pillar. Second pillar, no member state of ASEAN subscribing to the principle of non-intervention shall overtly or covertly criticize or critique too vociferously the military alliance or pact of the other member state. So when you take these two pillars into consideration and you embrace and internalize them, you are okay, even when you wade into the issue of, say, Cambodia and Thailand, because you are not supporting the members, this opposition movement of those countries. You're also not criticizing the military alliance and pacts that they have. And I've been trying to educate myself and students of international relations that we have been going round and around the circle without taking into considerations excellent scholarship by people out of the region who have very salient things to say about ASEAN. That's one. Aside from that, it's also important to eat a little bit of humble pie from time to time, because ASEAN, for what it's worth, is also an entity that is extremely good at event management, as and when the chair is in the hand of the right country. But when it rotates to a country that is unable to do it, you are potentially looking at a disaster. And I think Timor-Leste, the president of Timor-Leste, should be given proper credit for acknowledging that they cannot become the chair of ASEAN after the chairmanship of Thailand. In fact, there is now a big question if Thailand can perform its role as a chairman, given that animosity against Cambodia. And we are only a few years away. So within the region itself, and whenever we speak about region, we should also not be guilt-ridden, because under Chapter 8 of United Nations Charter, it's actually our responsibility to look after different regional priorities. So,
Can I ask you, on that definition of non-interference, especially that you don't support the opposition to, how does that square with ASEAN position on Myanmar?
so in
I know that's a difficult nuance to explain, I guess, right?
with due respect to everyone here, if I were to go on that issue, it's actually very nuanced, but it's also a concept that has been improvised over the last few decades. So, for instance, the concept of flexible engagement within the context of ASEAN was actually proposed by the late Dr. Surin Pitsuwan. But that phrase originally came from an op-ed by Anwar Ibrahim in Newsweek. And then it was, and Dr. Surin asked Mr. Anwar Ibrahim back then, who was then still the Deputy Prime Minister, can I enhance it? Can I use this for the Thai foreign policy? Flexible engagement. And even back then, Thailand was heavily involved with all kinds of activities in Myanmar, but not to the degree of supporting the student movement that escaped from the October 8, 1988 crackdown, if I may. Now, when it was in the hands of Indonesia, Pak Ali Alatas, the late Pak Ali Alatas, transformed it into flexible enhancement or engage enhancement. But whatever you name it back then, it was perfectly kosher, perfectly valid for one country to go into the affair of another, as long as you don't support the opposition movement explicitly. So within the context of how that actually raised ASEAN to be the paragon organization, a clear case being Australia and Indonesia's joint effort to resolve the Cambodian impasse after the Vietnam invasion into Cambodia. So ASEAN allows intervention, and there are many cases of intervention, but they do it either very quietly or out of sight. And when it's out of sight, when it's out of mind, and you also have what John referred to, struggle of terminology and terms over what really constitute international relations. So one of the best books on that help ASEAN decision makers and track 1 and track 2 community come to certain agreement of what each term actually means or refer to was by Professor Paul Evans and David Cappy, The Lexicon of Asian Pacific Diplomacy. So when we are trying to understand laws and principles, it's crucial to try to understand the terms and terminology that we are trying to use. So for instance, as early as 1999, I encouraged the Chinese University of Hong Kong to host the Harvard Asia Project in International Relations. And one of the workshops was on Track to Diplomacy, which was a thesis that I worked on at Cambridge University a few years ago. Back then it was 1996. And I explained to one of the professors in University of Hong Kong, Track to Diplomacy that was way 1999. Track to Diplomacy is one of the most important topic in ASEAN, because ASEAN Regional Forum came to be as a result of CSCAP and Track 2. But there's also, it was very curious because he asked me, this was 1999, and he was from China, and he didn't mean any offense. He said, we from China don't really understand what T2 means. Does it suggest that we are about to have a stake? I couldn't really capture what he was trying to say, but in other words, he couldn't wrap his mind around it. But if you look at China right now, Track 2 diplomacy is one of those things that they're very good at. And if it's not Track 2 diplomacy, it's Track 1.5 diplomacy. But within the context of what FPCI does, especially given the fact that one of your officers mentioned that the ASEAN People's Assembly was actually successful. Your activities actually manifest as track 3. But then if one of your participants is able to get closer and closer into the inner circle of the proper decision makers, doesn't have to be the senior minister or the president, just the senior officials meeting. From track 3, you can catapult yourself into track 2, track 1.5, and so it goes. So the key is not to offend anyone. And I don't think Myanmar is offended when we speak to Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, which is what Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim did earlier this year. But concurrently, he also got an agreement from Senior General Min Aung Hlaing that he would be speaking online to the representative of the National Unity Government.
Okay, good. I think one of the factors that we can use on ASEAN's positioning on Myanmar is that Myanmar signed on to the ASEAN Charter. And some of the things that are happening in Myanmar are inconsistent or in violation of the ASEAN Charter. And that way, ASEAN as a regional organization would have the right, have you said, or to actually engage Myanmar on this issue because it relates to provisions of the ASEAN Charter. But I want to bring us back to the next world order, and the one thing that worries me as somebody from the global south, from Southeast Asia, is the question, is the rivalries that we have now, is this a permanent thing that is locked into the international system and that will be carried on to the next world order? So is this permanent and not undoable, or is there a chance that this can be undone? Yeah. I'd like to get your position on this, and then, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
Products.
Thank you, Dino. I think absolutely we certainly still can revive that because you see after 80 years of a war, second war, and what have we got here so far? The prosperity, billions of people lifted out of poverty, and productivity has gone up hundreds of times. It's because of economic globalization, economic prosperity we have brought now. Now we are jeopardized that development. WTO has been one of the strong pillars, now has been marginalized. Of course, those multilateral systems like WHO and climate change and all those things. So I think there's two paradigms. There's two actually school of thoughts right there. Why is that? Let's drive up all the military budget. Let's have a big match on the defense spending or whatever. That is going to deprive the bread and butter for sure. I'm sure that the war is going to get very scarce on that resources. So I think what China has been doing, for example, it's not really seeking like-minded. Let's seek a development-minded. That's probably the most important. We don't need the like-minded because at the end of the day, the performance counts, right? We can't divide the world according to democracy or autocracy or that kind of a so-called value base because we see either different system, different ideology. Oh, I have a challenge, I have a problem, but we cannot classify. Oh, your mine is better than you. You are you are the worst. But that's really measured by the performance. So I think the biggest jeopardize of the world today is going to jeopardize the prosperity of the world, and then that's going to get in poverty, that's going to get into distrust, that's going to get into the war eventually. So we have to continue this economic globalization, even though it's not perfect, but that's what China is doing. See, China has joined RCEP. Now this part of the world is flourishing. Now China wants to join CPTPP, still in the process. China wants to join DIPA. And China is doing all those economic globalization incentives, like Belt and Road Initiative, China Development Initiative, and all those things. So I think economic globalization should be overcoming the secularization, the fear of the intensified secularization. So you look at what's happening, and now you have the you have this region of the world. You have those artificially, teamed up the kind of a security alliance, Quad, right? You had AUKUS, you had Camp David, South Korea and Japan. So you had all those things spring up now, and then China, what's doing Chinese on the contrary is doing all those economic alliance. China-African Summit, China-ASEAN. This year, China-ASEAN included the GCC countries.
But isn't economic success of China the reason why the U.S. is becoming insecure, which makes rivalry even more?
You're probably right on that, because like my friend Graham Madison, we've been talking dialogue for those number of years. I recently wrote a book of my dialogue with Graham Madison. He highly endorsed that. We published that in China and internationally. And he gave a copy to the leaders of China. So we want to escape that. I mean, as like President Xi said, the world is big enough. It can really accommodate both U.S. and China. It's not a you owe me. It has to be win-win-win for all
I'll
of us.
ask Gordon about it. Gordon, one of the most incredible things I've seen in this region, U.S.-Vietnam. Used to be enemies, kill each other, but now you're best friends, right? Can U.S.-China be that way?
I mentioned earlier on that there was a built-in fragility into the current system. And I'd go a step further. Not only are President Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or President Trump old, but none of them have a succession plan. So I can't say that the world that we're looking at right now is going to be the world of the next decade, because there's some fundamental instability built into that system. And in that environment, I'm actually more optimistic than not that again, whether you call it like-minded, whether you call it shared interest or not, the collective action, of a lot of different states on a lot of different issues is far more powerful than people actually believe, right? And it is just because we are now facing an environment where that's not just optional, it's mandated. I lately, just as a refuge for being depressed about politics in the world, have taken to listening to these big sweep of history podcasts, both out of the UK. So Rest is History with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, or Empire with William Dalrymple and Anita Arnand. And so part of me is thinking, all right, is the post-Cold War era, Francis Fukuyama, the last man at the end of the history, was that all fanciful? Was that wrong? I'm not entirely sure, right? I mean, we now have such communication, connectivity that never existed at any point in history. And I don't know that there are many people in the world who will be satisfied with the reversal of the last 30, 40, 50 years of globalization. There's built into that system churn. And so that fact that you've got built into the system churn, and that's taken true in a lot of different countries, and that's going to inform who they work with and how they work with. And the fact that, again, I'm really resistant to the idea of a G2, right? Because it doesn't make sense to me. What does that mean about Japan? What does that mean about India? What does that mean about Africa in terms of demographics? And candidly, I see among the three major powers some fundamental challenges that they're facing right now. So that just gives me some hope that dialogues like this, where Indonesia, largely through FPCI, but not just through you, over the last decade, has had a far more important convening and thought leadership role than you could have imagined 15 years ago. Wouldn't have ever thought that, right? And the truth is, Canada, after having a long time kind of been out of it right now, is rising to a level of prominence that it wasn't at 2 years ago, or 3 years ago in terms of that process. And so I'm pretty confident that the international community, even though we may not have the structure we had before, is going to have the underlying drive from the bottom up to work together on these issues. And if something doesn't happen, then we're going to look at it with different partners and approach it in a different way. So I've got this underlying tint of optimism.
Yes. Rich, please.
Yeah, so I wanted to respond as well that I think part of the difficulty of the last 20 years has been this attempt to say that there is one order, that it's all the same and we can do things one way, and that then, eventual kind of, the rigidity gives way to the resistance. But I mean, in any system, conflict is natural, and conflict is always going to be there, and it's got the potential to be productive. And so the realignment, certainly that we're seeing in the UK's policies around middle ground countries and working with like-minded nations. And I think that the thing to focus on will be the extent to which we're able to bridge that. So I think the threat comes from the insecurity, where one nation feels threatened because of another's success, and that leads then to military escalation and destabilisation for the whole region. But the extent to which these foreign policies are able to realign towards diplomacy, towards bridge building, and towards, I suppose, dialogue on a less hierarchical and more horizontal level, I think is key to managing those kind of very natural differences in a world that's this big and this diverse. How we manage that rather than try to flatten it out into just one unit.
So I'll go to the last part of our conversation, and it relates to what you said earlier, John, about how some of the multilateral institutions are just broken. WTO, you mentioned UN Security Council. But again, I want to relate this to the next world order. And the question is, look, you can't get rid of WTO, right? WHO isn't working very well either, right? The non-proliferation isn't working very well either. IOM, the migration, isn't working very well either, not just UNSC. So for countries like this that, hey, we want that platform to work, but it's not working, then what is the option? There are just two options. Do you stay with it, and it's like going to a broken car, or you try to fix it, but it's not fixable, right? So then what happens if we bring all this to the next world order?
So I think the options are very disconcerting, because one option is total collapse, which can mean, in the extreme, annihilation, because Henry's right that when this all goes badly, it does lead in the direction not just of conflict, but of war. And what we're really worried about in places like Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and so forth, is nuclear level war. And we have the capacity, and there's even revitalization of weapons of mass destruction and so forth. So it's not just the conventional weapons. This is deeply, deeply disconcerting, is a nice word. The other option is we are driven by fundamental interest, and we find the way to reform. It requires a lot of cooperation, a lot of creativity. I'm, aside from being a naturally optimistic person, as I guess human nature drives one to be, if we look around the world, actually, I would like to say a number of things are working, which we should not forget about. We saw this during the COVID pandemic. Within an extremely short period of time, the genome was mapped through cooperation on a global level. The development of the vaccines was light year. It was spectacular, and it was on a global level. And by the way, some of the actors were themselves already integrated. Scientists in Germany and Canada, and I forget where they all were. India produced, a pile of the actual vaccines and so forth. If I look now at China's work around vaccines on cancer and things like that, I mean, it's taking another level. So there's a lot of very positive things to say about cooperation that is happening, not just the institutions that are breaking down. We have to find a way to translate that kind of drive into a, you said it, win-win, right? I mean, the thing about development cooperation is it generates, it's not eliminating conflict. It's managing it in a non-violent way. It's not just a conflict exists, competition will exist. Competition in a positive way. One of the problems of the G2, which is deeply disturbing concept, is it is articulated as a win-lose and either-or, and quite literally the leaders bear a lot of responsibility. They have said this. They said, we win or not. It's brinkmanship also. It's now or we're disaster. We have to get away from that. Now, I believe that's possible. I think some of the institutions are reformable internally. We've seen some efforts, it needs to be more radical. We do know this is a matter of political will. You cannot leave these to the secretariats alone. This has to be political will. But some of them, in my view, are not really that conducive. I've worked for many years for the UN system and UN and regional organizations. I do think there will be a moment of creativity that brings us to some new level. And certain issues may require new institutions entirely, such as around climate change. But I'm not negative on this. I'm optimistic.
Go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I agree with John. I think that I'm very optimistic actually for the future. Cautious optimistic. Yes. Yeah, but I have three reasons for that. I think first is that the world is totally intertwined. We cannot go back to the isolation days. It's totally intertwined. So the forces to drive that is to continue, and the miracle like ASEAN, I mean, it's remarkable. And then we still have the European Union. Of course, we had this war on Russia with Ukraine now, but still, I think we probably still can come back on that. And so those regional integration is still happening, and RCEP, CPTPP, and all those things. So I think for the global system, we have a lot of a polymodal system, regional system to support that. So that's number one. I think that's still going to give us a lot of hope to sustain the overall, even though the master plan may not work, but a lot of the regional plans still work. And so that will help the world stabilize somehow. That's first point. Second is we have a lot of new institutions still happening now. Of course, we have WHO and WTO and all those IMF, World Bank, but we have AIB, we have new development banks, we have SCO development banks, and we have maybe there's going to be AI organization, climate, and then data. So we still have a lot of new way of doing that. Singapore and a few other countries now talking about there's some new trade liberalization scheme right now. So that's the other thing we're still inventing that process on that. And thirdly, on the G2, I do not agree with the term G2, but I do think U.S. and China does have some responsibility, a greater responsibility to really to contribute to the world. Like President Trump and President Xi had made a phone call, they have said, okay, they have to really work more together, consult together to solve the global tough issues, Ukraine or Gaza or poverty, debt, whatever. So the two countries has to collaborate. I think it's good way. The turning point this year, I really felt a bit relieved, is that after 8-9 years of Trump containing and bashing China and doing everything, I finally realized it was not productive. China can raise sanction U.S. too. They have never been sanctioned by other countries. Now China can raise sanction back. So it's really, if we get into this zero-sum game, that's really going to be lose-lose. So it's okay. Let's find a place. Let's accommodate. So I was really encouraged. I was at Beijing, attending the U.S. Embassy reception there. The head of the mission said, we need to seek strategic stability. Rather than in the past, we're talking about strategic rivalry. I mean, Rubio said that also. He took an interview from Fox News in July that we need to build strategic stability between U.S. and China. So that's a great news. So I think the G2, in that sense, if they really realize they are responsible, they have the huge responsibility for the world, and then they have to talk, they have to dialogue, they have to really overcome this zero-sum mindset. President Xi rightly said, let's get out of this vicious cycle of sanctioning each other. Let's really think about the world. So that's really the way I think I see some turning point there now. And also I see a parade of European leaders, global leaders rush to Beijing. And I see, okay, if we reach some equilibrium, and then it's the mutually assured destruction, might as well we seek a mutually of construction, mutually assured construction. So I think in that sense, I think U.S. and China have to find a way to work together. And now for the rest of the world, we have to, give more reflection of the G20 in the global system. So I think great countries like Indonesia is playing a huge role, and I'm very pleased we have this kind of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the word equilibrium, because that's how I want to end this. And I'm serious. This is what I feel when I was a diplomat. Yeah, because when I was a diplomat, we didn't have too many options, right? So if we were pressured by country A, for example, we didn't have time or any opportunity to go to country B or C or D and play that game. This was during the Cold War era, right? It's just either you accept that pressure and then give in, or you fight back, right? Malaysia has a lot of experience in it, but now it's so different now. If we get pressure from any country A, it can be from the West or the East or anyone, we got a lot of options, and that means what? The game of equilibrium is actually very much game on for everybody. It's very different now, having these options. And not only that, seeing the world, somebody said multipolar, right? I would say it's multi-models, right? It's just different models. I mean, when I was in with the United States, when I was ambassador and working at president of office, the way I would deal with China is very different than the way I would deal with the United States. It's just different models, different norms, different expectations, different ways of getting things done, and so on. So equilibrium, and I don't know about multipolar, but definitely getting used to multi models and multi options. I think that's what we anticipate the next world order would be like. So with that, I want to thank everybody. This has been a very fascinating discussion. I wish we can have another hour or two, but you all have to go to dinner. And John, congratulations on your new batik shirt. It looks very good. And you too. Yeah, we're gonna get you one. All right. Thank you very much, guys.